This guy just didn't steal from taxpayers. He took advantage of thousands of people, admitting them to nursing homes and living facilities that could not help them. His network of doctors gave out dangerous and harmful treatments and prescribing opioids to drug addicts just to make more money. Tell us how innocent people in the Somali community are being directly harmed.
Well, you hear about the threats that are happening against the Somali community. You're hearing about the broad demonization that's happening against them in the media generally. I think, I know we're running out of time here, but, if you look at the statistics, I believe it's 82 Somali Americans have been indicted so far. Out of 108,000 Somali Minnesotans in the state overall, that's something like a 0.07% criminal rate. When you compare that to 1/3 of all Americans have a criminal record, and I think it's 40% or approximately of white men under the age of 23 have been arrested. I don't think the statistics really compare.
Thank you, sir. I yield back.
What if the loudest cries of fraud were hiding something far bigger? In a tense hearing, Congressman Robert Garcia flips the script, defending U.S. citizens, naming billion-dollar criminals, and pointing straight at presidential pardons. Billions lost, innocent families punished, powerful people protected. And the question no one wants answered is, who is fraud really being used against?
Thank you. I just want to clarify one thing. I just want to just be very clear that a vast majority of those Somali Minnesotans are United States citizens, and Somali Americans have as much right to access those services, or any Somalis, as United States members of Congress. They have the same right to access services, and we're talking about U.S. citizens. Let me also just clarify, Mr. Hudson, you said in your opening remarks that I had said that no fraud exists, and I think you can feel free to run the tape. That's not exactly what I said. What I have been talking about, what's important for us to remember, is that wherever fraud exists, we should take it on, and we should hold folks accountable. And when people commit fraud and people get hurt, there's going to be repercussions, as there should be. We can all agree to that. We want to hold fraudsters accountable. We want to protect the victims and innocent people, so those that can access services can continue to access services across this country. That's how it should work. But we also know that's not how it should work according to President Trump. Now, let's actually talk about real fraud and some fraudsters. Now, we all know that recently, here in Florida, President Trump granted a get-out-of-jail-free pardon to Philip S. Forms. Now, Mr. S. Forms is a nursing home mogul convicted of schemes to defraud Medicare and Medicaid of $1.3 billion. Where is that hearing? This guy just didn't steal from taxpayers. He took advantage of thousands of people, admitting them to nursing homes and living facilities that could not help them. His network of doctors gave out dangerous and harmful treatments and prescribing opioids to drug addicts just to make more money. In 2019, when S. Forms was sentenced, Trump's own DOJ issued a press release that quoted that the man behind one of the biggest healthcare frauds in history will be spending 20 years in prison. 20 years in prison, the DOJ said. Just 14 months later, Donald Trump let him walk free with a pardon. In October of this year, on his 56th birthday, S. Forms was arrested on domestic violence charges. Let's look at another case, another Trump case. Joseph Schwartz, he was sentenced for taking advantage of nursing home residents and workers and defrauding the government of $38 million. Where is that hearing? Schwartz paid lobbyists almost $1 million to secure a pardon from the president, and it worked. In November of this last year, a full and unconditional pardon was granted by President Trump for this enormous amount of fraud. Now let's look at Paul Walzak, a tax cheat whose crimes cost taxpayers almost $1.1 billion, dwarfing what we're talking about today, as he made lavish purchases like a $1 million luxury yacht. Now, Mr. Walzak was supposed to spend 18 months in prison, a fraudster who we want to go after. He should have been held accountable for his crimes. And he was supposed to pay $4.4 million back to the taxpayers. While this pardon application was pending, his mom was invited to a $1 million per person candlelight dinner at Mar-a-Lago with President Trump. She attended, and less than 3 weeks later, her son received a full and unconditional pardon. Now, I'm assuming that our witnesses here today would think this is horrific fraud and would disagree with these pardons. I'd like to do you agree with this pardon? I'd like to begin with our witnesses.
Sir, I've not looked at the facts of the case or the law, so I cannot make a statement on that.
So you can't make a statement on these pardons. You haven't read anything about them in the news, apparently. These are pardons to criminals and fraudsters that our witnesses clearly have no interest in. Now, in Trump's America, rich people can rip innocent people off whenever they want and get a pardon. And the answer to fraud here is to cut off benefits to innocent people. Most of these folks are innocent people and kids who just need their services. Donald Trump's decision to freeze $10 billion in social services funding to 5 states does not hold criminals accountable. It hurts the very people who are harmed by fraud in the first place. Mr. Ballou, just finally, you are from Minnesota yourself. How are Minnesotans on the ground being hurt by Trump's political retribution crusade?
Well, the practical effect is that the pause on payments for childcare services and Medicaid services are going to result in hundreds of thousands of the neediest Minnesotans being denied, in some cases, literally life-saving payments.
And also, as we've been discussing here, there is a large, of course, immigrant community and a community that makes Minnesota stronger. Can you tell us how innocent people in the Somali community are being directly harmed?
Well, you hear about the threats that are happening against the Somali community. You're hearing about the broad demonization that's happening against them in the media generally. I think, I know we're running out of time here, but, if you look at the statistics, I believe it's 82 Somali Americans have been indicted so far. Out of 108,000 Somali Minnesotans in the state overall, that's something like a 0.07% criminal rate. When you compare that to 1/3 of all Americans have a criminal record, and I think it's 40% or approximately of white men under the age of 23 have been arrested. I don't think the statistics really compare.
Thank you, sir. I yield back.
What unfolded in that hearing wasn't just a policy disagreement. It was a confrontation over who gets punished and who gets protected when fraud becomes a political weapon. At the center of it, Congressman Robert Garcia, pushing back against claims that social services fraud justifies sweeping funding freezes, especially when those cuts fall hardest on Somali American communities in Minnesota. This matters now because billions of dollars are frozen, real people are losing access to healthcare and childcare, and the word fraud is being used as justification, without the same scrutiny applied to powerful offenders. What sounded like a technical budget debate quickly became something else entirely. A question of double standards. Garcia began by drawing a clear line. He didn't deny that fraud exists. He didn't defend criminals. He didn't minimize wrongdoing. Instead, he corrected the record. The vast majority of Somali Minnesotans, he said, are U.S. citizens. They are legally entitled to the same services as anyone else, including members of Congress. That distinction mattered because the implication hanging over the hearing was clear, that an entire community was being treated as suspect. Garcia then addressed a claim made against him, that he had said fraud doesn't exist. His response was simple: run the tape. What he had actually said was that fraud should be investigated where it exists and perpetrators should be held accountable without punishing innocent people in the process. Then he pivoted. If this hearing was really about fraud, Garcia asked, why weren't they talking about actual, documented, massive fraud? That's when he named names. Philippus Forms, a nursing home mogul, convicted of defrauding Medicare and Medicaid of $1.3 billion. Trump's own Department of Justice once called it one of the largest healthcare frauds in American history. 20 years in prison, they said. 14 months later, his Forms walked free, thanks to a presidential pardon. Garcia didn't stop there. Joseph Schwartz, convicted of defrauding nursing home residents and workers of $38 million, paid lobbyists nearly $1 million, received a full pardon. Then Paul Walczak, a tax fraud case costing taxpayers $1.1 billion, luxury yachts, lavish spending, a pardon granted shortly after his mother attended $1 million per plate dinner at Mar-a-Lago. And Garcia asked the question hanging in the room. Where were the hearings for them? Here's the part that often gets lost. Officially, the narrative is simple. Fraud exists, so funding must be frozen. But in reality, the enforcement is selective. When fraud is tied to poor communities, immigrants, or social services, the response is immediate and sweeping. Entire programs are paused. Payments stop. Families suffer. But when fraud involves wealthy insiders, politically connected donors, or billion-dollar schemes, the system suddenly slows down or disappears entirely. Garcia exposed that contradiction by doing something unusual in Washington. He compared cases. Same crime category, wildly different consequences. Another overlooked detail, the scale. The alleged fraud used to justify freezing social services doesn't come close to the billions lost in the pardon cases Garcia listed. Yet the punishment isn't directed upward. It's directed outward, toward children who need childcare, toward seniors on Medicaid, toward immigrant communities already facing threats and demonization. And when witnesses were asked whether they disagreed with those pardons, they declined to answer, not because the facts were unclear, but because acknowledging them would expose the imbalance. So the real question becomes, is this about stopping fraud, or about choosing who pays the price for it? The consequences are not theoretical. According to testimony in the hearing, the funding freeze is already causing immediate harm. Childcare payments paused. Medicaid reimbursements delayed. Hundreds of thousands of Minnesotans facing the loss of essential services, some of them life-saving. And the Somali community in particular is being hit twice. First, through loss of services. Second, through public suspicion. Despite the statistics, out of roughly 108,000 Somali Minnesotans, only 82 individuals have been indicted. That's about 0.07%, a fraction. Yet the narrative paints an entire community as a problem. That's how policy decisions ripple outward. A funding freeze becomes a childcare crisis. A fraud allegation becomes community-wide stigma. A political strategy becomes a real-world emergency. And once trust is broken between communities and institutions, it's not easily repaired. Realistically, several things are likely. Congressional pressure will intensify to restore funding or narrow the freeze. Legal challenges may follow, especially if states argue the cuts violate statutory obligations. And politically, this issue isn't going away, because it exposes something larger. How fraud enforcement is framed, who gets investigated, who gets forgiven, and who absorbs the damage in the meantime. This hearing won't be the final word, but it may be a turning point in how these narratives are challenged publicly. At its core, this isn't just a debate about fraud. It's a test of fairness, whether accountability flows upward to power or downward to the most vulnerable. Because when billion-dollar criminals walk free and children lose health care, the issue isn't complexity. It's choice. So the real question is this. If fraud is the justification, why does punishment fall on the innocent and pardons fall on the powerful? Let me know what you think.